So on that note, let me first introduce the first speaker of today, Dr. Shannon Olsson. Dr. Shannon Olsson heads the naturalist-inspired chemical ecology group at National Center for Biological Sciences, TIFR, in Bangalore. She's a Fulbright scholar and a Ramanujan fellow, and she's part of a huge effort to promote chemical ecology in India. And one of the amazing things she told me before, while we were having lunch, is that she loves Chennai weather. I can't think of many Chennaiites who would say that, but yeah. So let's invite Dr. Shannon Olsson onto the stage.
Now, yes. Hi, everyone. So I'm Shannon. So this is my family, and family is about connection. And connection is probably one of the most fundamental things that makes us human. Even why you're here today, right? I mean, if you think about why you're sitting in this chair, maybe it's because you wanted to hear some interesting information. Perhaps you've been dragged here by a loved one forced to listen to information. But whatever it is, it's about making connection. It really is fundamental to our humanity, and it's also fundamental to our world as well. Everything in our world is connected to each other, and it's actually how our living world survives. Every plant, every microbe, every animal on this planet is connected. And it's connected through what creates matter, which is molecules. Not all organisms can see. A plant can't see you. Not all organisms can hear. Bacteria can't hear, but all organisms can communicate through these molecules. And it's actually this vast communicative interplay that maintains the stability of our ecosystems. Okay, we talked about the strawberries. I'll just repeat it again so I can get into the talk, and I apologize for the delay. So the sweet smell of these ripening strawberries is not only giving you information that it is a good source of nutrition and carbohydrates, but that strawberry is also communicating with you to come and take and eat it and spread that information, that seed, so that it can make new strawberry plants. But not all fruit maybe wants you to eat it, right? This chili pepper, which is such a famous example of our Indian cuisine, as you well know, when you bite into it, you get this heat that is caused by a molecule called capsaicin. Now, capsaicin actually binds to a particular protein in your mouth that also detects temperature. So when you eat this chili pepper, your brain actually thinks that it's actually hot, even though, of course, it's at room temperature. Now, why would a chili pepper be telling you that? Because it's a fruit, right? It should want to be eaten because it needs to also spread its seeds. Have you ever noticed birds eating chilies? Parrots love chilies, right? Have you ever wondered how they can eat these chili peppers? You think, wow, they must have a good stomach. Well, actually, birds have a different type of protein in their mouths. It's slightly different, a couple of amino acids difference. So they actually can't detect the capsaicin. So all they taste is strawberries, right? Sweetness of the chili. Why would that be? When we eat chili peppers, or more reasonably, when a small rodent eats a chili pepper, mammals' digestive systems actually break down the seeds, so they actually can't germinate anymore. But when a bird passes the chili pepper seeds, it actually helps them germinate even better. So in that way, the chili pepper is having a different conversation with us and with birds. To us, it's saying, hey, hold on, don't eat me. But with the birds, it's saying, come, take, eat me, spread my seeds so I can make new chili pepper plants. And that is the wonder of this interactive communication. So I'm going to ask you a few questions during this talk, and I hope you'll participate. So here's my first question. What is this? It's a sea urchin. What is it doing? What is that? What is that? What is that? Any ideas? Shout it out. This is actually sperm and eggs coming from the sea urchin. Sea urchins are broadcast spawners, so they actually release their gametes to actually reproduce in the ocean itself. Now imagine you're a sperm, 5 micrometers in size, and you have to find an egg in the ocean. Pretty difficult, right? Obviously, they use chemistry to do this. So this is actually an experiment that I did way back when I was a postdoc. That's a pipette tip, and I'm injecting a molecule called Resact, which is a small peptide, into fresh sea urchin sperm. And you can see the sea urchin sperm is just accumulating at that signal. Individual sea urchin eggs release this peptide into the water, and sperm can travel for several centimeters to find that egg in the water, which it would never be able to do in the ocean without chemical communication. What about this? Do you know what this is? It's a plant, of course. Any ideas what kind of plant? It's a pretty famous plant. It's a tobacco plant. It's a wild tobacco plant. Some really wonderful experiments performed by Ian Baldwin at the Max Planck Institute for Chemical Ecology, where I used to work, showed that actually these tobacco plants eavesdrop on this chemical communication. When a sagebrush, which is a very common southwestern plant in the United States, gets injured by chewing caterpillars, it starts to release all of these volatiles into the air. And that tobacco plant, if it's close enough to that sagebrush, can chemically hear those signals, and it can start upregulating its chemical defense system. So if that caterpillar goes onto that tobacco plant, it's ready for it, and it can defend itself much better. So plants are actually listening, but they listen with chemistry. Now, what about this? What's this? What's the big thing there sitting on top? It's a butterfly. What's it on? I heard flower. It's not a flower, it's a fungus. This is called Puccinia fungus. It actually causes changes in the apical meristems of plants. So it actually makes them reproduce these florets that look like flowers, but are actually made of the fungus. Now, why would it do that? Well, it does that to trick these poor unsuspecting butterflies and bees to come to it and get covered in the spores, and those spores can then be transferred to another plant that also has spores on it, and that's how this Puccinia rust fungus can actually reproduce, by mimicking a flower. And not only does it look a lot like a flower, but it also smells like a flower. It actually produces the chemical bouquet of a flower. So these poor insects don't know what hit them. They think it's actually a flower. But unfortunately, they don't get any lunch out of it. They just get a bunch of spores on their body. What about us? Now, I don't think you greeted your family like this morning, right? But there is some evidence that also humans use chemical communication as well. And actually, when I was a grad student, I had to work with a bunch of high school students about my field of chemical ecology, which studies these interactions. And I had to do an experiment with them. So I said, well, what would you like to do? And they said, well, you know, we want to know if we can tell who our friends are by their smell. And actually, at that time, no one had ever done a study in science on this. So I took these group of 15-year-old students, and they got T-shirts donated from a local store, and they washed those T-shirts all in the same detergent, all in the same shampoo, and then they wore them for 3 nights, and they kept them in the freezer during the day so extraneous odors didn't get on them, and then they had to smell them. Okay, and they smelled this pile of 5 T-shirts that were all in individual bags, and they had to guess which one was their own and which one was their friend's. Out of 5 T-shirts, what do you think happened? First of all, what do you think they smelled? I asked them, right? Now, they were wearing these T-shirts at night, and in January in northern New York State, which is not warm, okay? So there was no sweat or anything like that. So when I asked them what they smelled, they said nothing. They couldn't smell a thing on these T-shirts. So then I said, well, guess which one is yours and which one is your friend's? And they said, I have no idea. I picked this one and this one. And it turns out that they were actually right. Most of the time, a statistically significant amount of time, they could not only tell which T-shirt was their own out of 5 T-shirts, but they could also tell their friends, which suggests that indeed we also are detecting these chemicals even from each other in the world around us. So ultimately, that's why I came here to India. This is one of the very first pictures I ever took in this country, and it's at a beautiful place called a Gumbe rainforest station in the Western Ghats on the other side of the country. And when I went there, I went light trapping, which is where you hang up a white sheet at night and you wait and watch as insects and creatures of the night come and are attracted to the light. And I watched as hundreds of species of moths and flies and small rodents, actually, and bats and reptiles all came flocking to this sheet. I'd never seen so many different kinds of organisms in one place at one time, and that is the beauty of this country. It has amazing biodiversity, and I thought, look at all these conversations I get to study. So that's what I did. So that's what our group does. We are called the NICE group, which is a funny name, but it means Naturalist-Inspired Chemical Ecology. So we work outside. We start outside studying the world around us and then come into the lab and try to understand these interactions and how the organisms actually detect them. And our research goes from the shade-grown coffee plantations of Coorg to black buck communication in Rajasthan. See that lady there, the female? She's sniffing that dung pile and she's deciding whether that's the male she wants to be with or not. That's also chemical communication. To understanding high altitude plant life in Kashmir, to studying pollination in the eastern Himalayas, which is here in Sikkim. And throughout all of these different experiments that we're doing all over the country, we've started to notice that these chemical conversations we're observing are changing rapidly. I show this picture in particular because it's the last time I ever took this picture. It was the first and last time. Because the following season, when we returned to this beautiful rhododendron valley, it was completely plowed over for development. And that's what we are in right now. We are in an age called the Anthropocene. You might have heard this word. It's actually a new geological age. You've probably heard of Jurassic, Triassic, Pleistocene. Well, welcome. We are in the Anthropocene. Anthro means human. So we are in a geological age that's entirely defined by the human impact that we have on this planet. We are changing the world in every possible way, physically, chemically, atmospherically, and obviously biologically. And so I couldn't really ignore the changes that we were making on these chemical conversations as well. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about for the rest of my talk today. And to keep you awake, I'm going to be giving you a quiz, okay? All right? So you have to remember this number, all right? So don't forget this number because I'll ask you to call it out a few times. All right? Ready? What was that number? 90%, good. Yes, 90% is actually the percentage of flowering plants that rely on animal pollination to some extent for their survival. And every single one of these, I imagine, very familiar fruits and vegetables and nuts on this page are entirely dependent on insects for their productivity. Without insects, these things would not be on our dinner table. And that's a big deal because actually 40% of our insect pollinators are under threat of extinction right now because of the Anthropocene, because of changes in land use, pesticide use, pollution, and all sorts of effects that we're having on our planet. This is a pretty big deal for India because we far outweigh all other countries in terms of our fruit and vegetable production. Fruits and vegetables generally need pollination. That generally comes from insects. So this is a big deal to understand this pollination, and this is something that I got very interested in. So I worked with a friend of mine who I've known for many years. Her name is Karin. And Karin, I moved from Germany to India. She moved from Sweden to Australia. So we had this question, how does pollination work in different places in the world, especially with all of the climatic changes that are going on? And can we use that to understand how pollinators actually identify flowers, and can we use it to actually create better ways for farmers to actually get pollination for their crops? So we started with this particular pollinator, which is called a hoverfly, which you might not have heard of, but they're really, really common. There's about 6,000 species of them across the world, and they're not the best pollinators. That's, of course, honeybees, but they are the most prolific. They're found on every continent except for Antarctica, and this is a picture. These are pictures that I took myself in all of these different places in the world. And you can imagine how different those climates and those environments must be in central Sweden or central Europe or the Himalayas, or in Bangalore, right? They're going to be getting very, very different plants. very different flowers. So how do they find flowers? Because it's actually the same exact species of animals. So they have the same antenna, the same eyes, the same ability to detect the world. So we wanted to study that, and so we went to all of these different areas. So this picture, again, is actually the research that we were doing in Sikkim, and we did this in these different regions I just showed you to identify what are the cues that these insects use in different places in the world. Do they use the same cues regardless of where they are, or do they use different cues in every different climate, in every different environment? And does that affect how they identify flowers? So we collected smells and colors and shapes. We detected heat coming from the flowers, carbon dioxide, UV, everything that we thought an insect might use to identify flowers. And then we turned it into a statistical model. So we had the statistical model predict for us what is the ideal flower in the Himalayas. Maybe it's yellow. Okay, what is the ideal flower in Bangalore? What is the ideal flower in Sikkim? What kind of smells would it have? Shapes, colors. And then, since they were statistical models that gave us actual physical things, we turned them into 3D printed models. So as you can see, these look a little weird, right? They kind of look like Lego objects, right? And that's because we weren't trying to recreate flowers. We were trying to recreate what would be potentially ideal cues for these organisms in each of these different environments. And then we planted them in each of these different environments, and the pollinators came to them, even though they weren't real objects. But interestingly, they didn't come to the same objects all over the world. One of them, that yellow object, was attractive in all the different places, but each of the areas had different characteristics, which showed us that actually differences in climate and differences in environment can have a profound effect on how these pollinators identify their cues. And we are changing this world. So what kind of impact is that going to have on our organisms? To answer that question, we went back to one of the places we studied, which is Sikkim. So now, are you awake? What is that number? 90%. Okay, 90% is also the upper limit, but it is actually a predicted value of the amount of glacier loss that the Himalayas may be undergoing over the next 50 years. It will be undergoing massive changes in its climate, and that will have very, very large effects on not only the livelihoods of the people there, but also the biodiversity, the natural world around it, and of course the ecosystems in general. So we wanted to know, how is climate actually affecting this interaction? And the Himalayas are a great place to study it, because mountains are actually different climate zones. Every 500 meters that you go up in elevation, you change 2 degrees, you change your UV index, obviously air pressure changes, humidity, all of these factors change drastically. So it's a perfect petri dish to study climate change, because the climate literally changes as you go up a mountain. And Sikkim is an awesome place to study this. So Joyshri, who is a postdoc that I shared with another scientist called Mahesh Sankaran, who's an ecosystems ecologist, we studied this in North Sikkim, and you can see right there. And what we wanted to see was, how do these pollinator relationships change as you go up the mountain? And Joyshri found something really fascinating that I didn't predict. Even though I've been studying chemical ecology for 20 years, I didn't predict this was going to happen. What she found was actually not only do the flowers, the same flowers, so what you see here are the 3 flowers that we studied. We studied strawberry blossoms. Remember the strawberries from earlier in my talk? We studied buttercups, and we studied this small flower called Lysmachia, which is a local flower. And in each of these flowers, we found that at different elevations, they not only produce different amounts of chemicals, which you might expect because it gets windier and lower air pressure, but they actually smelled different. They produced different types of chemicals. So a buttercup at one part of the mountain didn't smell at all like a buttercup in another part of the mountain. And I took English literature. I don't know if you did, but I read Shakespeare. And Shakespeare said a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So that's what I always thought, but that is not true. Flowers at different climates actually smell very differently. And if you use smell to find a flower, like insects do, that means that that could change whether you go for that flower or not. And so that's what we're testing right now. And so right now we're actually going through these experiments and testing artificial flowers that replicate different elevations to see whether this also changes how the pollinators behave to them. But I'm sorry, you'll have to invite me back again in a couple years for the answer to that question, because we've just started our analyses. So we also do a lot of work in Bangalore. This is my morning commute. But Bangalore is the garden city, and despite the fact that its gardens are dwindling rapidly, we do still have quite a number of flowers. And actually, even here in Chennai, I'm sure you've noticed there's a lot of pollinators in the city. You see bees, you'll see butterflies and flies and lots of insects that are right in the urban environment. So we also wanted to look at how this is affecting pollination in an urban area. And for this, I will ask you that question one more time. Very good. What could 90% mean regarding Bangalore? Time spent in traffic, very good. 90% of my time is spent in traffic, but that's not relevant for this. Very good answer. Anything else? You might be thinking it, so I'm just going to tell you. 90% is the percentage of cities, of the top 10 cities in the world that are in this country. All right? Congratulations. You live in the most polluted country in the world. Not a very attractive reward, is it? But it's true, and if you look at those cities, they are not, with the exception of a couple of them, the biggest cities, right? There are oftentimes these, let's say, second-tier, middle-sized cities that are embedded in agricultural lands. And most pollinators actually move around. They don't just stay in one place. So the pollution that you get from the cities actually can have a lot of effects also on our agricultural production. So my group decided to study this. We first did a back-of-the-envelope measurement of how many pollinators we saw inside Bangalore and on the outskirts of Bangalore, and we did see fewer pollinators per flower. So this gave us some indication that there might be something going on. But we decided to see if this had anything to do with air pollution. We selected 4 areas in the city that were very, very similar in characteristics in terms of their plant vegetation and proximity to water and traffic and all sorts of things we can control, but different in their amount of pollution. And this is work done by Geeta, who's a postdoc in our lab, and we studied this lovely pollinator. This is called the giant Asian honeybee. It should be pretty familiar to you. It's really common all across this country. It's native to India. It produces about 80% of the honey in this country. In Karnataka alone, it pollinates over 687 species of plants. It is super important. And it's often found in cities. It often builds its nest up in the eaves. It's called the rock bee. You've probably seen it. And depending on where you are, you might be in an apartment building that burns down the hive because they can be quite aggressive. Imagine burning the thing that creates your vegetables and fruit, but that's what happens. So we decided to study the effects on this species. So we collected them from these different areas, and we first tried to look at them up close to see if there's any changes we saw just looking at these bees' bodies. So this is a bee that was collected from the low polluted site. And any guesses for what those coffee beans are in its body? Pollen grains. Yeah, this bee was doing her job. She was collecting pollen as she should. These were all workers. These were all foraging bees. So we caught them when they were actually pollinating at those flowers, at these Tacoma flowers. So this bee was collecting its pollen. We also collected a bee from the high polluted site as well. And this is what it looked like. Now, you don't have to be a scientist to tell that there's a pretty big difference in this. The bees from the high polluted site were just covered in debris, okay? And this debris was all less than 10 micrometers inside. It was called PM10. PM10 is a very, very famous value because it's what's called respiratory suspended particulate matter. It's the thing that we always hear about when we hear about air pollution because it's the stuff that we can breathe in. It's all the particles coming from car exhaust, coming from burning biofuels, coming from industrial effluents that we can breathe in and that we know have a great effect on our human life. And this is what we found these particles containing. Again, I'm sure you're all familiar with many of these chemicals, and they're very toxic. And they have no business to be on a honeybee's body, much less in our lungs as well. So then we decided to look a little bit further. Was all this debris that was covering their body actually have an effect on their physiology and their survival? So one of the things we looked at was the heartbeat. So this is what the heart of a bee looks like. They have a long tube, but they have a heart just like ours. It just looks a little different. And here it's beating. They have an open circulatory system. So you can see this is the heartbeat of a bee from a low polluted region. And here's from the high polluted region. So interestingly, the heart rate is not actually different. But if you look, you can see that the rhythmicity of the bees from the high polluted site is completely off. We would call this cardiac arrhythmia, okay? If you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you you have cardiac arrhythmia, you're in big trouble. It is very, very dangerous. And this is what we were seeing regularly in bees we collected from the high polluted sites. And so as you can imagine, it also affected their survival. So we also collected some bees. We brought them back to the lab. We gave them lots of sugar water, honey water, and lots of care as we could. And we were able to keep the bees from the rural areas and the low polluted sites for many days, sometimes weeks we could keep them in our lab. But within 24 hours, the bees from the moderate and high polluted sites, 80% of them were already dead. So it has a massive effect on their survival as well. So you might be wondering, what does this mean? What does this mean actually? So why we did this study was because of this. So this is an air quality index. This is pretty much the air quality index for India as well. You've probably heard that term, especially if you've ever traveled to Delhi. You've probably heard the air quality index is X right now today, okay? And the air quality index, which is regulated at the country level and also is proposed by the World Health Organization, is based on the effect of air pollution on us. It's actually entirely based on the effect of air pollution on humans. What levels are dangerous for us to breathe in? But until our study, there really hadn't been a quantitative study on how air pollution affects other organisms, which are also important to our survival, like honeybees, right? Without pollinators, we also won't have fruits and vegetables, so it's also pretty important that we pay attention to effects of air pollution on them as well. And this is what we get when we do an air quality index for them. They're actually much more sensitive than humans are. And so when we think about policies and we think about practices for this world, for how we're affecting our planet, we have to not only think about how it's affecting us as humans, but also how it affects other organisms that also affect us as well. And so if we think about it from an insect's perspective, we're actually already too polluted. So we all recognize this problem, right? I don't think it's any news to you that air pollution is bad, and I don't think it's probably any surprise to you that it's probably not good for animals either, right? But the thing is we don't realize how connected we are to this problem. And I hope that by listening to my talk today, you realize that we're actually all connected. We're actually all one planet. And the effects that we have on our plants and our animals are also affecting us in turn. So when we think about what we need to do, we need to think of it as a connection. Our connection with each other and our connection with the world around us. So what can we do? So I want to leave you with some positivity. Because honestly, if I didn't think this was going to get better, I would just not give this talk, and I'd probably be in Bora Bora drinking Mai Tais, okay? So one is you should get informed. You're doing that today. You're coming to listen to all these wonderful talks. There's actually a lot of information out there. 80% of insect biomass has declined in the last 40 years. That's actually pretty well known. Maybe some of you in the audience knew that. But if you didn't, look it up. There's a lot of research out there, and it's also been translated into an easy-to-read manner. This is because of all of the things I've talked about today. And also get connected. Chennai is awesome. There's so much stuff already happening in the city to actually improve the air, the water, and the land. There's tons of organizations that are constantly trying to work, so connect with them. Find out what's going on in your community and participate in it. And also, talk to each other. talk to each other about this. I hope when you leave, you talk to somebody who didn't attend this talk and say, did you know honeybees are really getting affected by air pollution? I hope you do that, because it's only by doing that that we will actually be able to improve what's going on this planet. So I'd just like to finish. One is by thanking the funding and the institutes that I've worked with on this research, and that I'll continue to do so as long as I can do it. And I will leave you with a quote that comes from my daughter's presentation she recently did at school. And she presented this quote, and I thought it was very worthy to finish this talk. And she said, "This we know, the earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. All things are connected like the blood that unites us all, and man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it." Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. So we have a couple of questions. One of them is from an MTech student from Anna University. So how can we define consciousness in a scientific perspective? And how is it different from instinct in species? Is there any scientific way to prove this?
Well, that is something that I have been talking about in other contexts. So it's actually very, very difficult to define consciousness in a non-human perspective, primarily because we actually are limited. I've been talking about how we communicate with each other, but actually it's very difficult to communicate with organisms, right? I can't tell you what a honeybee is thinking. It may be thinking something very profound, but I have really very little ability to actually communicate with it beyond understanding its communication by dancing and things. So I think it's very limited. So until we have a better understanding of how organisms communicate, and that's some of the work that I'm doing, I think we won't even be able to answer that question about consciousness.
And the second question is, can honeybees be used as effective tools for measuring pollution? And this is by Dr. N. Parthasati. Sorry, I couldn't get the entire question. That's what I was trying here.
Yeah. I would like to say I hope they don't have to be used. I hope that we just actually lower our pollution levels so they don't have to be used. But yes, obviously they can be used as a good bioindicator. I don't think necessarily it has to be honeybees either, but they are something that's really commonly found in cities here, the giant Asian honeybees. So we actually, that was part of our efforts, was actually to see if we could come up with a good bioindicator for pollution levels. And since they are more sensitive than humans are, they are quite a good bioindicator for that.
Yeah, so could you?
As an effective what?
As a better standard tool for the pollution.
A tool. Yes. I think we can actually, and because these experiments are pretty easy to do. So you could actually, one of the things that we want to do in the future, we're actually working here in Chennai with Sri Venkateshwara College, and they actually have an ability to create pollution. So we're actually standardizing this in a laboratory setting, what pollution levels precisely and what compositions actually do have the effects that we see in the natural world, and then that actually will give us a better metric to connect it to the air pollution. So yes.
Okay, so thanks a lot for that great talk.
Thanks.
So we